Okay, so our guest for this week is Ryan Blakeley. Ryan is a visiting assistant professor at Northeastern University, where he teaches courses about the music industry and the global music economy and focuses his research, as you will hear, fascinating research about global streaming and how streaming functions in the vast amount of the world that is not the relatively limited spaces where Spotify is licensed to operate.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
So, I guess maybe to start, we met at a conference about popular music, and you gave this great talk about kind of global streaming, the global streaming industry, and how it's shifting and proliferating and how it develops. So I guess maybe to start with, we talk a lot on the show about the streaming economy. And in doing so, I think we fail in that we often talk about it as the streaming economy when in fact it's the Anglo-American, maybe Anglo-European streaming economy, right? Apple Music, Amazon to a certain extent, YouTube, uh, Spotify, right? Like Tidal. We did an episode on Tidal recently. But so maybe to start with, do you think you could just take a second and kind of contextualize how much of the global streaming industry is that, and how much is sort of completely off the maps of most of the discussion about the streaming ecosystem and the streaming economy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you're saying, I think most of us in North America and Western Europe, when we think about streaming services, we're often thinking Spotify. Spotify is the biggest in the world by far, close to 300 million paying subscribers. I think they're at over 750 million like monthly active users. Massive, massive company that does work globally. Like they're in, I think it's like over 180 different markets now. So massive global company. And then yeah, we have, Apple Music, we have Amazon, some of the more niche players like Qobuz, Tidal, things like that as well. So there's a lot of focus on that. Um, but there really is this whole other ecosystem of what I call regional streaming services that are focusing on specific locations, specific countries, territories. And these services tend to be less of like the overall global economy, but they're very specific to those places that they're in and often have a lot of draw within those communities. Um, and to be a little bit more specific, with these regional services, they can really vary in scale and scope. So, for instance, there's a really big service that exists throughout Africa called Boomplay. There is one that is in the Middle East and North Africa called Angami. And there are several other such kind of regional services across the world. In India, there's JioSaavn in Ghana. And so, although on a global scale, they don't take up as much of that pie as Spotify would for those individual countries and regions. Often they are bringing in a lot of money into the music industry. They're bringing in a lot of local listeners. A lot of local artists are kind of focused on those services. But as you were saying, often that stuff kind of gets overlooked or is not as considered as significant because it's less prevalent, in North America or Western Europe.
Yeah, I mean, and clearly, I mean, I think a lot of these economies, the financial income is lower, right? You can, $20 a month goes, or $12 a month, or pick your streaming service, goes a long way in a lot of these places. But just like India is an enormous market. So is it that folks there or in China, the greater Middle East, are not streaming in a financialized way? Because of course, Spotify is the biggest streaming service, unless you count YouTube, which not YouTube Music, but like YouTube,
Right.
which in some ways is a music streaming service, just not in a traditional sense. I mean, so yeah, so like, are those folks not paying for streaming? Are they not using streaming? Is it?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of different factors at play. One thing I'll mention too, since you were talking about China, one of the largest streaming services in the world is Tencent Music, which is operating only in China. And so that's another thing where, a lot of people don't necessarily know or think about that, but that is a really significant service that is only operating in one country, but is like bringing in, tons and tons of money. So there's that element of things. But speaking more specifically about some of the markets where maybe, as you were saying, money might be going a little bit further depending on the context. A lot of these
Hmm.
more regional or niche services are specifically trying to attract consumers um, through a number of strategies, some of which include lower monthly rates. Maybe it is a free plan that's like ad supported. It could be a situation where the streaming service is bundled with a telco. So like depending where you're getting, your smartphone, your internet plan, maybe that streaming service is kind of built into that package. So there's definitely that economic aspect of like how expensive the subscriptions are, how much people are able to pay for them. And then there's other elements as well, like the infrastructural component. Some places have much
Hmm.
less robust internet infrastructure. It's more difficult to stream music. And so as a result, regional services may be offering more downloads or opportunities to stream with like lower audio quality so that, they can still listen to music. And then beyond that is also just kind of targeting the specific cultural and musical preferences of audiences. So when you have a company like Spotify that is trying to like be everywhere all at once, they do kind of tailor their service and their offerings to whatever market they're in, but they can't really be super specific and super local in the way that some of these companies can, where they will highlight local artists and local musical styles on a level that's much more granular maybe than Spotify, or they'll feature interfaces that are in like really specific regional dialects that again, like for a massive platform like Spotify, maybe they don't have the resources to like have every single, local dialect programmed into their interface. So there's all these ways that regional services are trying to cater their offerings to the local
Yeah,
listeners.
yeah, no, and it's interesting thinking about like, do these tend to be, and of course you can't generalize, we're generalizing across the whole world, we're doing exactly what I started off by criticizing myself for, but do these tend to be mobile first? Again, I'm just thinking about the very beginning of my use of Spotify, um, where you sort of would stream on Wi-Fi and then try to like locally download stuff. Like I remember the year where I was like, oh, I can just listen to any music wherever I am instead of just like waiting to load stuff onto my phone.
Yeah.
Are most streaming services now mobile first, or is that also up for grabs, like dependent on regional infrastructure, etc.?
Yeah, I would say mobile first, just in the sense that like most people now when they're streaming music, it is going to be through their cell phones. It's less through like, desktop computers or things like that. And so I think this is part of the reason why telcos are in particular like really invested in kind of streaming services in a lot of places because that is where a lot of people are listening to music. It's where they want to be able to like find and listen to it is on their phones. And so I think that's definitely a big part of it. If that's answering your question about the mobile aspect.
No, totally. And I think so. Maybe let's talk a little bit about telcos because I know that that's been a huge kind of driver of streaming service adoption. Um, to a certain extent in the U.S. I mean, you could argue like the cell phone plans that gave people phones that were able to run, gave people smartphones, or financed people's smartphones in complicated ways.
Yeah.
Um, but maybe we could start by kind of having you talk through like what those collaborations with the telcos look like and how they fit into maybe, again, this is difficult to generalize across the entire earth, but maybe like what was there previously, and feel free to like concretize that in a specific music streaming ecosystem if it's easier and more accurate to do that than to generalize across 2/3 of the earth's surface.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like one of the really big challenges about talking about this stuff, like you're saying, is every single place in the world has its own history, its own development of music through different musical figures and infrastructures and companies and labels and collective management organizations. So it is really hard to generalize, like you're saying. One example that I find really interesting that launched a few years ago is in Greenland, where they the state-sponsored telco TUSAS launched TUSAS Music, which is a music streaming service that exclusively hosts Greenlandic music. Sorry, they have over 5,000 Greenlandic tracks in there. And so people who are using this telco, which is state sponsored, it's the only telco that's available, they are able to get access to this music that is exclusively Greenlandic, that is something that ties to their cultural heritage. It's something that they're much more invested in as listeners because, again, it's, music from their own culture. It's not Spotify saying, listen to every song from around the world, all the, pop stuff. And so that I think is a really interesting case where we have a state-sponsored, telco that is offering this music streaming service that is explicitly and exclusively about Greenland and Greenlandic music and culture.
Yeah. So that's a really, and I think that that's a really interesting example because it gets us at the sense of possibilities that this topic opens up, right? There's been some really exciting thinking about Liz Pelly's book about Spotify, about the ways in which streaming, the specific like ideologically organized instantiation of streaming has created one set of musical practices and forestalled or overshadowed other ones. And so there is this amazing sense that there are all these possibilities, right? So in that example, maybe we can dig into that to like get a sense of those. So is Spotify not available or Apple Music not available in Greenland, or is this a competitor?
So in a sense, it's a competitor. So Spotify is available in like Denmark and therefore is available in Greenland from what I've been able to determine. And so it's not like there isn't necessarily access to other streaming services. And I think one of the big selling points for some of these niche regional local services is that they're not trying to say, we are Spotify, we're going to offer you everything that you want to listen to. We're going to like compete with them head on head or head to head, sorry. Instead, it's like, what can we offer that is distinct, that is going to specifically like cater to this population, that is going to be interesting to them, that would be a draw that's not just, Spotify 2.0 or like here's like Greenlandic Spotify or something like that. So I do think it's less about having access to all the music and less about trying to compete with Spotify and Apple Music and more about like trying to find ways to be like, this is specific to this location. This is some new value um, that we're offering. In that particular case, I do believe that one of the conditions of having your music on TUSAS Music is that you within Greenland can only exclusively have your music on that service. Outside
Oh,
of outside the territory, you could have your music on Spotify elsewhere, but within Greenland, you couldn't do that. So it's a way of kind of compelling artists to use that
oh,
platform.
that's really interesting. So then it really sets up. It's not just the Bandcamp option. Where like, oh, you can listen to this on Bandcamp, but you can also listen to it on Spotify. And sure, it's I guess maybe more ethical on Bandcamp, though you don't pay anything to stream on Bandcamp, and technically you are at least paying something on Spotify. But also on Spotify, then you can't jump. You can listen to the weird uh, indie noise band and then the Rolling Stones or Britney Spears. But this is actually saying like, no, 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 no. That's really, really like this is only all the Greenland music, or at
Yeah.
least that's the goal, I guess. Like all the like, if you want to be listening to our music, it has to be here, and all of our music is here, and it's not external, and so it kind of creates it's almost like a nationalistically organized streaming structure.
Yeah, and I think like again, this case is so interesting because it is in some ways like government backed because it's that, state sponsored telco. So there is like this element of this being more of a governmental cultural initiative rather than like we need profits, profits, profits. So that aspect
Yeah.
of it I find really interesting. And from the report they put out relatively recently, it was I think around 6,000 subscribers. To Tusos Music, which is about 10% of the entire Greenlandic population. So when you think about
Right.
like the scale we're operating on, like it's pretty incredible that 10% would be using that service.
And are they able to model like different streaming payout structures? Are they able to model more equitable forms of the streaming industry within something like Two Sauce Music?
Yeah. So again, like I feel like every service is approaching it in its own way, which makes it difficult to generalize. But to stick with that example, Two Sauce Music, for one, they've adopted a user-centric instead of pro rata royalty model. So as I'm sure you're aware, instead of just doing things proportionally based on what everybody listens to on the platform, whatever every individual listens to, that's where their subscription money is going. There's been a lot of like debates about pro rata versus user centric over the last few years. So that's something that they're um, uh, dealing with. And then as far as the like actual distribution of revenue, it's quite similar to Spotify in that the platform itself, so Two Sauce Music, would be keeping about a third of that, and then two-thirds is going to rights holders. In this particular case, that is going through Coda, which is a Danish collective management organization, and DigiD, which is a digital distributor. So getting some of the money out to rights holders through different organizations.
I mean, are there Greenland specific labels? I mean, because that's the distribution, at least for U.S. streaming, right? It goes to labels and then it's paid out to the.
Yeah, so there are some specific like Greenlandic labels, and just like in the United States where the royalties will go to the publishers and the labels, and then will go to the artists. It's the same kind of thing there. So instead of PROs, it would be through this CODA collective management organization. So that is kind of handling the performance royalties, mechanical royalties, things like that. And then through DigiD, which is the digital distributor, that would then be going to the artists or the rights holders, if those would be like the record labels.
And what are people? Do you have a sense of like what people think about this? Like, what would musicians think about this? Because there is, in this funny, there's something a little bit. I mean, it's this interesting mix, right? Of both being like, folkloric, nationalistic, government sponsored, like library music core, but also it's a little coercive in that you kind of like it makes every artist choose: are you on this platform with all the other Greenland artists, or are you on this huge platform and you can't be on both?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why it seems like you can be on the major platforms outside of the territory, but you're right that like that is kind of a decision that you have to make, and I think part of the argument is if this is going to be like this cultural streaming service that aggregates all the Greenlandic music, and there's a sense of like national pride that's associated with this. That would be kind of the draw for artists. They also say that they're paying artists on average about 4 times more than Spotify just because of the way the model works and because they're not competing with everybody else, right? The
Hmm.
way Spotify works with the pro rata model is everybody's put in one big pool, it's all divided up. And if you are like a relatively niche artist and you're competing against Taylor Swift and Drake and Bad Bunny, it's going to be really tough to make as much money from that. So I think part of it too is like they're arguing that they can pay a little bit more because it's this kind of very local, closed off musical environment.
Yeah. So thinking about that, I mean, it's one of the interesting moves that feels like it's kind of percolating in the ether around a lot of these culture platforms, right? Is this new idea of like algorithm as speech. This has been, there's some of these lawsuits that are the Facebook lawsuit, or the Meta rather lawsuit in Arizona. I can't remember what state it is. I don't know if you've heard about this. Where basically like it's not the argument is that algorithms shape inputs enough that sure the platforms aren't responsible for this, the safe harbor laws aren't responsible for the things that are on them, but the algorithms that sort those things are a form of speech. And I think I've seen this pop up more recently in some of the Canadian legislation. I don't know if you've seen that, right? In particular, I was intrigued, right? There's this broader reorganization of CanCon. And then more specifically, the throwing a wrench into everything, Quebec language politics, arguing that the same way that a certain percentage of all songs on the radio need to be French language. That if these, if they're going to be licensed in Quebec, these streaming services need to recommend a certain number or a certain percentage of French language materials, or at least that's the suggestion that some folks are making, and that is one version of the law that um, Quebec passed. So I don't know if are you seeing those kinds of dynamics either built into these localized streaming systems, given their ties to nation states, given their ties to telecoms, or something that's starting to emerge?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, that's like a fascinating example. And I'm Canadian, so I'm definitely familiar with like CanCon. And I mean, for so long, Canada, very clearly with radio stations was like a certain percentage of the music needs to be Canadian. In Quebec, like you're saying, language is so important. You need to have, you need to meet your quota for language. And yeah, like they're having these debates about like how do you apply that to streaming services where people have more control over what they're listening to. It's not radio where it's just kind of, one song after another, but you get to pick. And thinking about the role of the algorithm in that too, absolutely is really interesting. It's like how do you like foreground certain styles of music over others? So that's getting a little bit away from your question, but
No, no,
I
no.
think
It's
that's really fascinating. I think when it comes to some of these other regional services, again, I think it's really hard to generalize. Some of them, like that Greenlandic one, it does feel very much like um, an intentional move for like cultural preservation and supporting the local scene. In other cases, to be honest, I think it is just like we have this like potentially untapped market. We're gonna try and, make what money we can. At the end of the day, these are like the ones that aren't, state sponsored are businesses, and their end goal is to get subscribers and listeners and people to buy their phones and phone plans. So I think there are definitely many cases where this is like seen as a form of trying to improve culture, and then in other cases a bit more just kind of like business as usual, trying to find a new like audience to make money from.
so, but is it does when a telco is when it's via a telco, does it alter things? I mean, it suggests to me that there's less competition, in that there's usually, this is really based on my very limited knowledge of non-U.S. telecommunications structures, but it's often like one or two, or sometimes even just one major telecom provider. And whether that means that there's even less maybe streaming choice in some of these countries than there is in the U.S., where I guess there's choice, but they're all kind of the same.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. Especially in places where maybe there are fewer options and like your only way to get music is through this, telco. But I think in recent years, because Spotify has spread so far, like it's hard to find a lot of places where you can't get Spotify now.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe, 10, 15 years ago, um, uh, it was these telecom companies were playing more of a role in kind of like bringing people in and like, locking them into certain styles of listening or like platforms to listen through. I think now because Spotify is so widespread and it's trying to compete in all these markets, we do have a bit more competition that way, and maybe there is less power in those telcos than, you know, pre-streaming, at least from like a musical perspective.
So another kind of like unifying factor, and this is the kind of the core of the talk I saw you give, is this fascinating set of middlemen that have started to emerge in the global streaming economy, right? And these are, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong here, like companies who's basically help set up the streaming infrastructure, both like rights and tech, for these various kinds of streaming services that are proliferating across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is something I find really fascinating, and it's something that I think by design often is kind of behind the scenes, out of sight. Uh, but thinking about like the ownership of these platforms and like who is building them and who is like providing some of the tech, there are examples. Some of the really big regional services, they have the resources to build their own service. They can get everything out there themselves. But realistically, especially when we're talking about really like niche styles of music or communities or regions, Building a streaming service is really expensive. Like, not only do you need to have the backend infrastructure, you need to have the like app design, you need to figure out licensing, which is, an absolute nightmare. And so there are like business to business or B2B companies that are out there that are basically saying we are going to for a fee, of course, we will provide you with the backend infrastructure. We're going to provide you the app, and you can put in your branding, you can put in your own like features and music, but we're kind of providing like the shell for this so that you don't need to build it all from scratch. And so one of the services that I talk about is Tuned Global, which is based in Australia. And this is a company that has created dozens of like niche music services, including some of these regional ones. They also do music for like in-flight entertainment, background music for stores. And so this is a company that is basically providing this infrastructure to other companies so that if they want to launch a streaming service, they don't need to do it from the ground up. And Two Sauce Music in Greenland, they've worked with Tune Global. Um, Portal Disc, which is a Chilean company streaming service, they worked with Tune Global. There's a bunch of others as well. Dido, which operates across Africa. So yeah, like you're saying, it's this really interesting phenomenon where we have these really specific regional services. But in order for them to have the resources to exist and to be able to do music streaming in the first place, they have to go through a different company to provide a lot of those services because otherwise, out of pocket, doing it yourself is just, out of the reach for a lot of people.
So I'm wondering if you say a little bit more about like what that infrastructure really consists of. Is it like full stack development? Is it rights? Is it like just contractual know-how? Like what's it consist of?
Yeah, so in the case of Tuned Global, at least, they offer kind of like a range of services. So on one hand, it is like the full stack. They will provide, they'll store the music, they'll like ingest all the music into the, platform. They will provide the app and the interface, API for like features. They also provide things like recommendation systems, so you don't have to like build a, recommendation algorithm from scratch. But they also are helping companies manage the licensing process. They themselves
Mm-hmm.
are not the ones who are doing those deals, but they're helping out a lot of companies with setting up those deals, with walking them through the process. Because, I mean, the technical side of streaming is one thing. The licensing side is a whole other thing. And, as you know, like to get the major labels on your side, if you want to host major label music, you need to like work with them directly, incredibly expensive. You need to like prove that you have a game plan that they're going to want to sign off on. And so these B2B companies are really kind of at this middle point where they're helping with the technical side, maybe helping with the licensing, so that again, a company is not coming along saying, "How do we do this from, square one?"
That's really interesting that the kind of uniformity of like recommendation algorithms or like licensing deals with the majors, it's interesting because I understand why that's so crucial, but also it suggests to me that would kind of constrain these niche streaming services' ability to deal with substantively different like musicking traditions.
Yeah, and I think part of this is like, a company like Tune Global will work with the company to like try and tailor and specialize it and get it to their needs. But you're right that there does seem to be this kind of like mismatch between the very specific like local mission of some of these organizations with the fact that they are reliant on these other global players, right? And I mean, there's so many layers to this as well. Like to go back to Two Sauce Music, like that's a Greenlandic service, but it is at least partially powered by this Australian-based B2B company. It has to go through like Danish, rights organizations because of, the whole, history there. And so like uh, when we try and actually like think of how a service could be like truly local, all of a sudden you see the ways that it almost can't be because there's so many of these different like global or, country level factors at play, which I find interesting, but also it's really difficult to kind of untangle all those threads.
Just thinking about that global reach is also like, where are the data? Where's the data being kept? Like, what machine actually starts spinning when you start listening to a track? And I don't know, like if we're got this interesting example in the paper about this kind of not quite Pan African, where it was it East Africa was mostly the streaming service
There's
based
like
in.
several that are based and like cover different parts of Africa or the entirety of it. Um, uh, and I think like two of them are interesting to me for a couple of reasons. Well, they're all interesting to me. Um, One of the ones that I mentioned that is at least partially powered by Tune Global was Dido, and that was one that frames itself as Pan-African. I think
Mhm.
it contains music from all the African diaspora, so beyond even just Africa, but is very much focused on like African music, music of the African diaspora. And then there's other
Mhm.
examples like Boomplay that I was mentioning earlier. Also, I think throughout most of Africa now. And that one, I mean, that's really interesting when you look at who owns Boomplay because it's kind of a joint venture between Transsion, which is a Chinese smartphone manufacturer that's responsible for like I think at least half of the smartphones in Africa, and they're combining this effort with NetEase, which is a Chinese internet company. And so this really big, African streaming service that, is
Whoa.
across the continent is really owned by China and these Chinese companies. And so again, when we think about like some of these global connections, as we're looking at these regional services that are saying, we are an African streaming service that's going to be featuring, artists from, the African diaspora, but it's owned by, Chinese companies, and so it gets really interesting and lots of things to, kind of think about there.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating. Also, just in terms of where do the profits stay, and the
Yeah.
potential for a company to be selling the music of a place back to that place and just extracting value.
Yeah, and so I think with a lot of these services, again, there's kind of a paradox here where um, on some levels and in some cases, it is very much about like enriching the local creator economy and like bring money to the artists, focusing on local music. Uh, but on the same hand, in some cases, like this one, there's also some of these like neo-colonialist, aspects to it where there's kind of this extraction going on. And again, so much of this is like behind the scenes that it's not always easy to like identify or pick apart, but seeing like the flows of capital like you're talking about and where the money is going definitely raises some of these
Yeah, I mean,
questions.
also thinking complicated questions about the cultural marketplace, right? If we're thinking about the histories of colonialism and neocolonialism, which are not just about raw capital extraction, but also about like the creation and promotion and maintenance of various forms of cultural hegemony, right? And I think that it would be you don't need to be wearing a tinfoil hat to think that it matters who owns the platforms in terms not just of where the money goes, but of what kinds of culture or what kinds of cultural activity gets supported.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, so do you see differences? I mean, clearly the one in Greenland is like an obvious um, example, but like even between um, a Chinese owned platform in Africa and I mean I don't know what's the funding of the Middle Eastern ones like? Do you have a sense of that or of the Indian
Yeah,
ones?
so I think in those cases, usually they are owned by like big media entertainment conglomerates within those countries or regions. So as of I think 2024, Angami, which is the big service that's in the Middle East and North Africa, that was is now largely owned by OSN, which is a really big, again, media entertainment conglomerate based in Middle East and North Africa. So there, it's not like, a different country is kind of having ownership over this or something like that. That is kind of staying within the area. But again, I mean, as with a lot of these big platforms, like a lot of it's at the end of the day, kind of like big finance companies, whoever's got all the money and the resources up at the top.
OSN headquartered in Dubai.
Yeah.
Right, right. But again, and this is there's one set of dynamics of not to get way out over my skis, but like, the complexities of a place, of like Al Jazeera, right, which clearly has ties to certain kinds of power structures, but also is within a region, and so, like, reading its potential biases or how it fits into the like discourse structures. And so yeah, so there's one set of just dynamics for a big media corporation conglomerate from a region in the region, and another one, um, yeah, like you said, without those same ties.
Yeah.
So that's so interesting. What about areas in which there's concerns about internet freedom, right? Like either China maybe or Russia, where there's real, you don't necessarily want the full major markets where you might not want the full major label catalogs on these streaming sites.
Yeah, well, like when I think about China, for instance, they don't have Spotify there, but they have like Tencent Music and NetEase Music, I believe. So like those would be like full catalog kind of alternatives to Spotify that would exist in markets where you can't have access to something like Spotify. But
I
then,
just wonder if there's another
yeah,
dynamic of somewhat more authoritarian or centrally controlled nations in which there might be maybe more active censorship of music, right? Of what kinds of music people should have access to, and if you had any sense of how that might also play out in these the music industry structures of these local streaming services.
yeah, that is a really great question. I will say I am probably less familiar with like how that might play out in some of those contexts. You saying that has made me really want to look more into that because I am curious how that would play out. Again, I do know that like talking about China and like having, 10-cent music, like there's these ways in which every market has its own history and its own background and its own relationships to
Mm-hmm.
culture, as you were talking about earlier as well. And so I imagine that would be no different, but what would be different, I guess, would be what people would have access to and what, maybe the algorithm is, feeding them and things like that. But
Yeah, and just also maybe agreements about what you get access to. Um,
absolutely.
Whether that's explicit political stuff or just music that's advocating dissipated hedonistic lifestyles, right? Like,
Yeah. And like thinking about that too, and this is like a little bit different and but I think speaks to the way in which like different platforms can regulate different cultural content or different, beliefs or values is like this Angami platform,
which is
for
where
instance,
again?
has every Ramen
Oh yeah,
that's
right.
Middle East and North Africa. So they have every Ramadan a Ramadan mode where it will foreground all kinds of podcasts and information and content for people to listen to during Ramadan. So like there's an example of something like, Spotify might have certain, aspects of that, but it's not really catered to an audience that, is going to be as focused on that. And so like you're saying, the platform where it's located, the kind of listeners it has, the kind of religious beliefs or backgrounds or values, that can all be, tied to what the platform is going to be offering. And on one hand, it's the listeners and that audience that's determining what the features are going to be. But on the other hand, the features, I'm sure, also kind of like, reinforce that as well. So that's just one example of that. But a lot of these services do something similar, whether that is a focus on specific subgenres or specific events or festivals. So there's definitely a way in which like the services can um, really like foreground certain values or beliefs or cultural traditions and so on.
So maybe to start to wrap up, I'd be interested to see what you think of, or how you see these systems changing, especially going forward, right? Like, this is an impossible question, but 4 years from now, the world still exists. let's put AI on the back burner. There's some generative stuff, but we don't have, mecha gods. Um, what do you like? How do you think that this system will have changed? How is it changing now?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's so hard to answer because things are changing so fast in the music industry, as with everything these days, and AI certainly is accelerating a lot of that. Um, I think that people, I think that there's always going to be demand for alternatives to big platforms like Spotify, whether that is through these regional services or other niche services. There's like classical music services like Idagio. A lot of public libraries have their own music streaming services for local communities. So I think there's going to be this continued demand for alternatives. That said, when we think about like the financial viability of some of these really niche platforms, it's really difficult to sustain yourself when streaming really relies on scalability. And if you're working with a very specific population or in a very specific area, it's questionable how long-term financially viable that can be. So I think there's going to be more of these platforms. I think some of them may find success in really kind of, drumming up local interest. I think others just are unfortunately or fortunately, depending on the context, going to be able to sustain themselves. Um, I don't see a future in which these regional platforms are going to overtake Spotify or Apple Music, but maybe are going to kind of settle into a place that is alongside them. And again, it's also difficult to generalize because, as we talked about, some of these platforms are really niche, really small. Other ones like Angami, like Boomplay, they have large, large audiences. They're already quite stable. So I think those are going to continue to exist. They're going to kind of exist alongside Spotify, but I don't see a world in which, every country is going to have its own, regional service or something like that.
Yeah. No, well, thank you so much. Ryan, do you have any upcoming publications you'd like to plug?
Yeah, there's a few things that have come out in the last little bit. I have an article about Nintendo's music streaming service for sounding out. So getting to some nerdy video game music stuff. An article about how streaming has affected classical music and the metadata issues there, the background music industry. Some more stuff in the works, but not coming out in the near future. So can uh, can leave it with some of the previous things. I did want to mention as well that um, a lot of the work that I'm doing now is very much influenced by some really great academics and scholars who are also doing work on like streaming and its effects around the world. So I did want to mention two major projects in particular coming out of Europe. So the Platform Use project, which is headed by Robert Prey, and Music Stream, which is headed by David Hesmanhall. Those groups are doing fantastic work about music streaming across the world and breaking out of just kind of like the Spotify, global north perspective. So I did want to plug that because they're doing all kinds of wonderful stuff and really worth checking out.
Cool. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. I really appreciate your
Yeah,
time.
thank you so much. It's been fantastic to talk about this with you, and yeah, look forward to keeping in touch.